Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Doctor2Doctor in the Chatroom. We are happy that you have decided to come back and share another hour with us on a Saturday afternoon. We appreciate you guys for doing that each Saturday, and we cannot continue to do this without you. So thank you so much. Hello, Dr. West. How are you, ma'am?
Good, Dr. Shaw. How you feeling today?
I'm doing okay. I want to remind our audience too to just stay safe and remember that we're still, I don't know, where are we with this pandemic? People seem to be kind of relaxing a whole lot with this thing, but we still say stay safe and wear your mask and wear your mask. Yeah, wear your mask and get those vaccines if you haven't, and if there's no reason why you can't get boosted. There's no reason why you can't, but at the very least, wear those masks, when you're in crowded places, and just stay safe and keep those around you safe. Today is no different. We have a relevant topic that impacts our communities and our world, and we're always excited to be able to bring you guests that are experts in the areas of our topics. And today we have another expert in the area of our topic. We're going to tap into a topic that is always near and dear to my heart, and that's education. Because once an educator, always an educator. That's what I say. Right. Dr. West is going to introduce our great guest in a moment, and we're going to just get the opportunity to learn something kind of new about trauma-informed schools. For years, schools have been trying to address learning and behavioral problems and dilemmas of children, just using those traditional educational strategies. However, we've seen that using these strategies really has, resulted in minimal success. So, and research has taught us that, we've got to focus on the root causes if we want to prompt change in these areas. So, let's talk about trauma-informed schools. Childhood trauma is a huge concern for our children. And because, so many kids come through our schools, this is a great setting for us to identify what's going on with our children and work towards healing trauma. So let's dive into some discussion after we are introduced to our special guest, Dr. West.
Yes. Okay. So I'm really, really excited. This is a personal friend of mine, Dr. Michael Brown. He is a lifelong educator. He's been in the game for 22 years. He was born and raised in inner city, New Jersey, attended Hampton University. Shout out to those HBCUs. Yeah. Received his master's from Boston College and then his doctorate from Vanderbilt. Dr. Brown has been a classroom teacher, a school principal, and currently serves as the chief schools officer for new schools in Alabama, where he works towards development, sustainability, and effectiveness of public schools across the state, predominantly those
awesome,
right? He has a beautiful wife who is also a principal, and two very adorable children, 9 and 11 years old. So let me just tell you real quick what I love about this bio. I just asked Dr. Brown to give us a little bit of information about, what he does.
Yeah.
I just said, give me a couple bio points. What I love the most about it is that not only did he tell us what he's been doing professionally, but he gave us a little bit of information about, personal, where he's from, where he grew up.
A look inside of his life. Yes.
Yes. And then that, to end it off with the awesome piece about his lovely wife, who's also an educator, and his kids. I think sometimes when we are asked to give a bio about ourselves, we give all the professional stuff. We don't really talk about the personal, but the personal a lot of times is what draws us into that profession and makes us so passionate about it. So I love that you did that. But yes, without further ado, let me just introduce y'all to my very good friend, Dr. Michael Brown. Thank you for being here, friend.
Yes.
It's been a while. You are.
Dr. Sean, Dr. West, thank y'all for inviting me. I'm really excited about the work that you guys are doing when it comes to mental health, awareness and trauma and stress. And so I love the work that y'all are doing. So I'm really excited to be on your show and to hopefully contribute to something so that listeners can get a better understanding of everything dealing with stress.
Yeah, we have nerded out quite a bit, the two of us, about trauma-informed stuff and research. So let me start by asking you, how did growing up in inner city New Jersey kind of shape your perspective, or how did it make you, passionate about what you do now?
Wow. So once again, thank you. And I always include, where I grew up in a bio, or whenever I have to talk about myself, because where I grew up was such a part of my journey, and it really, really contributed to how I think and how I operate and how I move around in the world right now. For one, just on the very base level, just never forget where you came from, and never forget the people who nurtured and poured and raised you. Because if I ever become anything in life, it's really because of the shoulders of the people that I stand on that came before me. And so I thank God for my parents, for my village, my neighbors, my grandparents, my church, and everybody who just every day help feed and nurture me. And I bring all their messages, so they might not have the degree, they might not have the specific training, but everything that I say now are messages that I've been learning from them since I was born. And so I'm glad to be able to do on this platform and share with the world the messages that they gave to me for me to give out to back to the community.
I'm absolutely stealing that part. I bring all of their messages. Yes.
I mean it.
Love it.
I mean it. My grandfather, and we'll get into more of this, but my grandfather, who literally would take me to the slave plantations that our family worked on in Virginia. And my grandfather, who grew up at a time where African Americans, really were not able to go to college, through all kinds of discrimination, that was outward. But I learned more from him than I ever learned from anybody with a PhD in my life. And so I got to bring him to the table, because I'm able to get in rooms that because of discrimination and racism in this country, he was not able to get into. And so I got to bring his message. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Powerful.
But when I look at New Jersey and where I grew up and how it informed the work that I do, I grew up in a rough area, so just kind of like to set this up. So Dr. West, you already put out there, I've been in education for 22 years. And so I have some time in this game. And so I'm not a baby. I'm 42 years old, and been in education, all of my adult life. And being from New Jersey, so I grew up in the 80s. In the 80s in New Jersey. And just to situate where we were in New Jersey, in Irvington. Irvington is kind of a twin city to Newark, New Jersey. Most people know Newark, New Jersey, but don't know Irvington. So Irvington is a twin city to Newark. It's 5 minutes away from Newark, Orange, East Orange. So that's the area that I kind of grew up in. And Newark was the third worst city in America at the time.
Wow.
And Irvington being his twin city, Irvington was called the carjacking capital of the country. And so, so you remember like when carjacking became like literally like people were, pulling you out of your car. And so it was a carjacking capital of the country. So this is the kind of place where I'm growing up. And, it's a very, very small area, but in an urban center, it's densely populated. So population density is huge. We're packed on top of each other. So one small block that takes you 2 minutes to walk, you literally are, walking past hundreds of people. And so there's a lot of crime in the area, but the crime is done in such a small part of the city that every crime committed in the city is felt and impacted by it. Like someone in the room is impacted by it. And so you're feeling all the effects of the local city. This, of course, spills out in education when you go to schools. And so the state had taken over our schools because our schools were underperforming. And of course, teachers were just inadequately prepared to deal with and address all these things that, that kids are coming in with. Not to mention, first and foremost, they weren't from our area, nor did they look like us.
Yeah, right.
And so that sets up a whole other dynamic that our kids are often dealing with. The high school, do y'all remember SATs? Like, I know that right now, especially in the southern states, ACT is the main thing. But when I was growing up in the north, it was SATs were the main thing. And it used to be on a 1600 scale. right? Like, so, it used to be a 1600 scale. So 800 for ELA and 800 for math. So just to let you know, all of the students in our city, in this rough city, had to go to one high school. There was only one public high school. So we all went there, thousands of kids there. And the average SAT score, to let you know just about the performance of the area, was an 820 out of 1600. This was the average. And so what you start to see is that no matter, whether you are a self-motivated student, whether you struggle with academics, whether you came from a great household, whether you came from a household where parents were struggling, two-parent, one, we're all in the same area dealing with the same thing. So individuality was almost like not a part of it. We were all dealing with the systemic issue that was going to impact all of us. None of us were ever going to come out unscathed.
Wow.
And so this is the area that I grew up in. And as I was able to grow up, and thank God, went to, I got away out of New Jersey, went to Hampton University, and that was just a whole different life to where you're just seeing Black excellence on a whole different level. Now, mind you, I'm from Irvington, so I'm one of the poor kids in Hampton, right? But I'm there and we're just seeing the young people who look like us, who will one day move on, hopefully to change the world. And we were just kind of like in this incubator, called college. But I look back at my neighborhood and I realized that I did not make it, as so many of my friends didn't. And it wasn't because I was so good. It wasn't because I was so smart, because literally they were scoring higher on their standardized test than I was. I did more homework, but they were scoring higher on their tests. And it wasn't because of any one great thing that I did that helped me make it to college and that held them back. Literally, in all caste systems, there are some who are allowed to get out.
Yeah.
And because of just a number of different situations, I was one of the ones who was allowed to get out and to move forward. But I recognized that I left so many behind. And so I had to, I forget who said it, but there's a quote that basically says, if you look at a river and you pull one fish out and the fish is dead, then you observe and you analyze the fish. But when you go in the river and all the fish are dying, you have to observe the water. And so I had to observe the water that I grew up in, because I realized that when so many were being left behind and not making it, it was not the people, it was the situation that we were growing up in. So that's what kind of directed my life towards education, and specifically to really deal with and address this, the situations of emotional health, mental health, and trauma, and the effects of trauma on people and communities.
Yeah. So when you talk about trauma, I heard you mention, carjackings and crime and, all the things that happen in inner cities. Can you talk a little bit about the trauma-informed approach? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
Give us kind of a definition, or, for somebody who's never heard of it, why do we need trauma-informed approaches in schools?
Okay. All right. So for a trauma-informed school, and I don't want us to get hung up. I don't want us to get hung up on names, because there are a lot of great names. We are good with naming things, and so it's a lot simpler than it may sound. But it's a trauma-informed school is simply just a school or an educational institution that that intentionally creates an environment to where all students feel safe, seen, and supported. That's all it is. And really, a trauma-informed school, it moves past just the academic, impact or capacity of a child, but it really provides a holistic learning experience. For one, and it builds on the idea that students are more than just their intellectual or academic capacity. They are whole people. And so a trauma-informed school just takes all that into account, and it prioritizes the person over the output. It prioritizes the person over their individual performance. And that's what a trauma-informed school does.
Okay, I have a question about that. It prioritizes the person over the output. Like I said, once an educator, always an educator. And output and numbers, and teachers are even evaluated based on how the standardized tests say the children are doing in the classroom. So what's different about that piece with trauma-informed schools? I mean, does that part go away? I hope it does, but does it? Does it not? What does it look like?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So, as a school principal and an educator who works and coaches principals, we are absolutely beholden to, well, for one, we want students to learn, and we also want to make sure that we can measure students' learning to see if we're doing what we think we're doing and what we hope to do. So that's natural. The way the state, implements standardized testing for every student every year, that is much. That is a bit much. That's a lot. That's a lot. But because the state, we are operating state schools, and so the state does create the I guess the criteria for what success looks like. We are beholden to that, and so I have to make sure that our teachers are teaching standards-based, instruction, and that we are moving students academically. So that is always a major part of what we do in the day. I realize, though, that I realize, for one, that there is no academic success without emotional sustainability for students. Students will not learn if they don't feel safe. Students will not perform if they don't feel loved. They will not even show up to school if they don't feel seen. And often, while we're trying to build the academic capacity of students, we've almost made school kind of this alien place to where they come in. And here's the thing, and I don't want to downplay or disrespect what the schools are doing, but I hear a lot of terminology about, we call students scholars at schools. We scholars, our scholars, and the reason why schools do that, and principals and teachers do that, is because they want to make their schools seem like it is a place of learning, and I get that. I've done that before, but I do understand this. When we talk about wording, I don't call my kids scholars, I call them children, because children are to be raised. Scholars are just to be taught. Wow. And so I want to be intentional about, so even in creating trauma-informed schools, if your school is only about scholars, then you're only going to teach academics. And I know what your purpose is, and that is all you will do. And so we want to raise children in which they're building their academic capacity is one aspect of raising children. They are not just the intellectual capacity. And so a trauma-informed school tries to address all that. And so what do we do in a day? There are many things that we do that I'll explain throughout this podcast. But first, just in a timing of day, there are academic periods, but also create intentional time to help build students, build their time as a community, and build them up as individuals, not just their capacity to understand math and ELA, social studies, and science. And so we'll talk about what those different moments in the day look like in a moment.
Wow. I love that, calling them children and not scholars. Wow, because we are responsible for much more than just their academic well-being.
Absolutely.
And we are going to talk more with Dr. Brown on the other side of the break. We will be right back on 94.7 in a moment.
And we are back on Doctor2Doctor in the chat room. Thank you for sticking around with us on this Saturday. We have Dr. Michael Brown here. He is telling us all about trauma-informed schools. And we're really learning a whole lot this afternoon. Yes. So Dr. Brown, I want to just go back into it.
Yes.
Here's a question for you. So I've had a lot of experiences where people might say things like, I don't understand why kids, can't just go to school and learn, right? Like, what's the difference between kids in the inner city and the kids in the suburbs? And why do they need all these, considerations and extra resources? And so I think that maybe is kind of part of where trauma-informed school, or the trauma-informed principles maybe came from. But talk to us about, does this work? What is the need behind it? And just give us a little bit more about trauma-informed schools and why that it's necessary and if it works.
All right. Absolutely. So, and I've also heard that a lot, well, why do we need all these things for these kids? What's the difference between the areas? Why can't they just, and the problem is that we all, and the state and the federal government also thinks this way to a certain extent, which is why they kind of give everybody the same test. Yeah. They give everyone tests and they measure it all, so the kids who are growing up, in rough situations in inner cities across the country, dealing in high poverty situations, are taking the exact same standardized measurement tests that the most resource kids in the country are. And no one asks what's going on with them. They just look at the measurements and they look at the scores, and then they punish the school, they punish the kid, they punish the parent for the outcomes or for the disparate outcomes. And no one questions society. and no one takes ownership in society about the disparate situations that students live in. We're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which really just simply, is a pyramid that basically says that in order for people to reach the top of the pyramid of self-actualization, there are some very, very basic needs that need to be met to really kind of progress through the pyramid. On the very, very base level are just the need to breathe, the need for food, the need for sleep. But at the second level, you start talking about more abstract things like the need for safety, the need for care, the need for security. And when you start looking at those things, you automatically start to see that kids that grow up in high impoverished areas, whether it be Black or white predominantly, or or immigrant areas, when there's high poverty, the first thing that goes is a sense of security. Food security goes away. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Housing security goes away to where you're not sure if there's going to be a note on your door that says you have to move. And and I don't know about if any of the listeners have ever lived in low-income situations, but when you have to move, you're given 10 and 15 days. You're not given 2 months to find other arrangements. Right. Sometimes overnight. And so kids who are 10 years old are going home with that worry and that stress on their mind. Yeah. The security of will your parents be there? The security of, if your parents are working 2 jobs, will they be able to meet you at the house and feed you when you get there? Those securities are all gone. Physical security is gone when you're living in areas that you cannot afford to get out of. Right. So when those securities are gone, this is what your brain is dealing with. This is hard for a 25 or 35 or 45-year-old adult to deal with and still work and be productive and to do their high and to perform tasks at their highest cognitive levels. Well, what does it look like when a 12-year-old is going through it?
Right.
And then that 12-year-old gets to school worrying about all this, the most basic needs. And then the first question we say is math. Yeah. Answer the question. And and then we measure their ability to be able to cognitively, do this academic task. And then we look at them as academically deficient when truthfully their brain capacity and their mental resources are really trying to figure out to meet their most basic needs, not this math problem. And that's what we're actually measuring. So we're measuring, can the kid make it through all these situations and still perform? And that's rough because we know that the kids who don't have a lot of situations to work through are the ones who will have the clearest brain to be able to perform these academic tasks. And that's what we're seeing measured out. And that's what schools are asking for, unfortunately.
So have you seen,
school, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Now, have you seen, both of you, I know I've seen it in social media, the story about the young boy going to school, and they talk about all the things he had gone through prior to getting to school. And then, but all the teacher kept harping on was he didn't have his pencil.
Oh,
right. Yeah. He wasn't prepared for class. I had a guy in education say to me one time, he talked about the 3 E's: economics, exposure, and eating. He said, kids come to school, they haven't eaten, they're hungry, they're gonna have a problem learning, right? Economics, they don't have any money for, to have a home and food and all the things, the things that we need money for, they're going to have some problems. They're going to, and they're not coming in sharing that with the teachers most times. Right. Most times kids are ashamed, right? To say what they're going through. They want to, with their peers, to appear to have it all together. And then exposure. And this is the one that I really kind of liked. And it reminded me of when, and y'all can be funny if y'all want to, because I know I'm old, but when I was going to school and, if I learned about Europe, I had to go, y'all don't remember those encyclopedias we all had in our homes.
I remember.
So I had to go to that encyclopedia, or I had, and look at pictures or whatever whatever about Europe in my book, my textbook, right? But, I didn't get to, my parents couldn't say, well, we're going to go to Europe over the summer. Since you learned about it this school year, I'm going to expose you to it, over the summer. So exposure is huge,
Absolutely.
And so that's a positive exposure if I could have gone to Europe, right? Yeah. But then in this instance, we're talking about those negative exposures, that those things negatively that children are being exposed to that negatively impact how they learn.
Yes. Yes.
And you know what? It's so interesting that you brought that up, because I remember, I remember thinking and hearing trauma does prevent a child from being able to really imagine different scenarios for themselves. And I think it's just what you said, like, we don't get exposed to a whole lot of things. Well, they might get exposed to a lot of negative things, but that, backpacking in Europe exposure, we don't have that. And so we can't even bring our minds to think that is a possibility, or to think that that's something we can do. And so our kids just come in automatically, at a deficit, and then maybe even leave school still behind
at a deficit.
In the ability.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
And I mean, and Dr. Brown, I mean, like, well, first of all, we're not saying, that all kids of color or whatever, what I'm saying, right, don't get good exposure, and parents don't do, we do the best we can, right? But he talked about this systemic thing, and let's just be real, it's there, right?
Yeah.
It's a piece of the puzzle. And so, and as a result of it, we are, as you said, we are at a deficit a lot of times. I mean, I went to the University of Memphis when it was called Memphis State. I wasn't really prepared for that. It didn't feel like I was a great student in school growing up. And I look back now, and I'm gonna tell y'all, I was in a little country town, but when I say I had some of the greatest teachers ever.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anybody out there that's listening that's related to Mr. Joe White. I was just talking about Mr. White the other day. He taught me in 3rd grade, and I know he's transitioned. He taught me in 3rd grade, and I will never forget how he taught multiplications. And it was my first experience. I'm 55 years old. It was my first experience with rap.
Wow.
We didn't know what that was then. I don't think anybody was talking about rap when I was in 3rd grade. I don't know, but I'm serious. He taught us our multiplications using that strategy, okay?
Wow.
And we were able to wrap those things off, and it was so much fun. I had some really, really great, creative, innovative teachers. But then, we could only do so much, right? From a perspective of funding, and, the most we did on field trips was the zoo. You knew every year you were going to go to the zoo until you got to a certain,
right.
grade level.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Brown, you mentioned something during the break, I think that you really is near and dear to your heart, and it's the mental health piece of addressing children's mental health needs.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So as a teacher, I saw a lot of students struggling, just because of traumas, traumas and different experiences they've dealt with. And as a principal, especially in Memphis, it was exacerbated by this extreme poverty. And you see it. And once again, when you see so many students dealing with it, you understand that you really have to address it. This is not an individual situation. As a principal, I remember sitting on my couch at night, and it is now, about 11:30 at night, and I'm staying up late, and I'm sitting there, my wife is still on the couch, and she's kind of, dozing off, and my phone starts blowing up. And I look at my phone, and it's the teachers at my school, and they're texting me, and they're saying, "Mr. Brown, did you hear? Did you hear?" And so I turn on the news, because they kept saying turn on the news. And when a child, when a child is killed, someone under 16 on the news, they don't say the name. They will just say, especially when it's happening, they'll just say the community in the neighborhood. But I know what apartment complexes my students go to, and so, or live in. And so I didn't know who it was, but I knew that someone had died. I knew that they were underage. And I'm sitting on the couch. And so, I put my clothes on, not knowing. And so when you don't know which student or which child passes away, you start to mourn all of them.
Wow.
You mourn them all. You mourn them all, because you don't know who you're going to see when you get there. So literally, I put my clothes on, and I don't know what I'm doing. That's the apartment complex, and I'm just getting up and I'm just going. I put my clothes on, and now it's midnight, and I'm just driving out to the apartment complex, just to see. And literally, if I know that my kids live there, even if it's none of them, I know that once again, it's somebody that they know, it's a family member, their family member or a friend of the person who was killed, or of the perpetrator, the one who did it, which means all of us lose people.
Yeah.
All of us feel it. And I remember going out there, in my first time going out there, and I just went out there and I pull up and it's midnight and the whole apartment complex is outside. And I see the investigators out there, and I see the yellow caution tape and everyone, and I see parents and I see kids, and I see so many of my students, so many of my children from my school out there, and they're like, how is it, Brown? How is it, Brown? So they're walking up and now they're giving me hugs, and I'm sitting out there, and I'm just amazed that the whole community is outside.
Yeah.
And there's a dead body laying right there covered up.
Wow.
And while this is happening, you're seeing parents once again crying because they won't release the name of who's laying there. But every mother is saying that my son is not home yet, that might be him.
Wow.
Every child is saying my oldest sister's not home yet, that might be her. And so everyone is crying, knowing that they lost one, but don't know who it is. And I'm out there, and this is a shock to my system. And I'm struggling to deal with it. Now, mind you, I am an educator. I'm an adult. Thank God I have a job. I had the resources to be able to pay for counseling. I had the ability to be able to, cope with certain things. My kids who are out there don't. They're 10 years old, they're 11 years old, they're 13 years old, and they don't. And when we get to school the very next day, all the kids I saw out there the night before at midnight are in school this morning, and they're still able to smile.
Wow.
And I could not believe, just to see that they're dealing with trauma, but their resiliency is amazing. So while I'm still mourning for the person that died, I'm also celebrating their resiliency and realizing that they're so much better and tougher than I could ever be. I'm seeing that. I see, I remember getting to school and there was a fight in the first thing in the morning on the bus, and I'm there at 6:30 in the morning to make sure that everybody gets there safe. And there's a fight on the bus, and there's a young lady that comes off the bus after I break it up. And I'm the only adult there because I'm principal. I'm the first one there in the building. And I see this young lady, and she's coming off. She wasn't even involved in the fight, but she's screaming. And so I go calm her down, and she's just screaming, I can't take this anymore. I can't take this anymore. And so all the traumas that this violent interaction that had nothing to do with her triggered for her.
Yeah.
It triggers so many different emotions for her. And I'm dealing with that. I remember going to classes where I see a young lady who has panic attacks and she faints in class. Nothing is happening at the moment.
Right.
But she has a memory and she's passing out. I see my boys who I'm walking in their classes and they can't keep their heads off the desk. They're sleeping in class, can't stay awake. And we usually punish that educationally because we say they're just not engaged. They just rather go to sleep. When really, when we ask more questions about trauma and about their situations, you realize that they're sleeping in class because they can't sleep at night.
Wow.
They can't sleep at night. And if you think about it, you go to sleep when you feel most comfortable, when you feel safe, when you close your eyes. And sometimes I realized that our school building was the only time that they felt safe enough to close their eyes.
Wow.
And to relax enough to sleep. And so I had to deal with and first recognize what trauma looks like and plays out in school, and recognize it for trauma and say, tomorrow when they come to school, I have to do something as a school, I have to do something better to make sure that when they come in, we're addressing all these things. And so when we come back from the next break, we can actually talk about some of the things that we did in school. But I will tell you this. When I was looking at all these different things, I had to realize very, very quickly what was happening in their bodies. And so I literally started just studying what happens in a trauma response. And I realized that trauma was, that when someone is going through a traumatic response, there's an overproduction of cortisol in their body. And I was like, well, what is cortisol? Like, cortisol is your stress hormone and you need it. And so it releases throughout your body to help you get up for a big event, good or bad. But then when you overproduce it, it can kill you. It becomes poisonous.
Yep.
And so I realized that when our kids are going through a traumatic experience and they're having a stress response, their body tenses up and their heart rate picks up, and it increases. I realized that like their body identifies physical threats and emotional threats as the same thing. Yeah. And so your physical body gets ready. Even when you hear bad news, your physical body prepares for a fight, and their blood pressure is increasing like is literally pumping, their blood is pumping to muscles to be able to get energy to deal with whatever it's going to deal with. Crazy thing is this, biologically, anti-inflammatories are dispersed throughout your body to get your body ready to deal with battle. And our kids were dealing with this every time they got emotionally hyper. This is their stress response that they were dealing with. And so I said, as a school, we got to help kids. We have to help mitigate the effects of trauma. We can't take away all the traumas, but we have to help mitigate the effects of it. And so from then on, I really moved to a practice in a school that helped address these things to help create a calm environment for students so that as they come in the building, they felt safe, seen, and loved and supported. And so we'll talk about some of those specific strategies when we get back from the break.
Wow. Let's talk more with Dr. Michael Brown about trauma-informed. We'll hear more about trauma-informed strategies in schools when we come back from break. We'll be right back in a moment on 94.7 FM.
We are back on 94.7 FM. Thank you for hanging out on this Saturday. We have Dr. Michael Brown, who is doing a fabulous job at breaking down trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed principles. During the break, we were talking a little bit about, sometimes when people hear trauma-informed, especially when it comes to schools, sometimes people think or say things like, aren't you giving these kids an excuse, to be a, quote, bad kid? And it really is not about that. And I think you've done a great job of really explaining how it really is just taking into consideration everything the child has been through before they walk into the school building. So can you talk a little bit about just the framework that you all use, some of the interventions or maybe strategies that you use in your school?
Absolutely. So first, and I've heard teachers say that, and even teachers that don't admit it out loud, some of them may be resistant because, for one, it feels like more work, which is the first thing that people think of, and giving excuses. But truthfully, the idea is, helping people be the best versions of themselves is our goal. And once again, there's and that's academically, that's emotionally, that's socially, that's everything. And what we'll realize is that in a trauma-informed school, you don't have less structures, you have more, or you have different. And so it's definitely not allowing just whatever to happen. It is being intentional about creating an environment to where kids can thrive. And we understand that if we don't address the trauma that kids deal with, they will never ever be their best academic selves. And so if teachers are just looking for academic growth without addressing where students are and meeting them where they are, then that growth will be limited. And so if we do this right, we will see an increase in student proficiency and student scores, in the school, not less. And so I want people to think about that as a source of motivation.
Right.
And the framework that we use really kind of starts off, in understanding trauma. And of course, schools have not done well with dealing with trauma. And so I did not go to schools, or I did not look to the study about schools to really kind of develop or think about what are the best strategies for schools to use. If schools are struggling with it, I don't want to study schools about how to do it best. So I thought about, well, who has been dealing with stress outwardly for years? And it's interesting because the military has. Wow. The military has been dealing with stress. And so it's interesting. So PTSD, you're familiar with that term? So PTSD. So the first version of that were written about in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-1 version. 1952 was written, and they called it gross stress reaction. They called it shell shock. I don't know if you remember that, but when soldiers were coming back from war after being on a battlefield, and they came back and they said there was something wrong, like everything's not clicking for them anymore. They had a hard time, dealing in regular society. They called it shell shock. They called it soldier's heart. These were the terms of the diagnoses that they called soldiers who were no longer able to function because of dealing with a traumatic situation. That was in 1952. They came back and they saw inattention. They were distracted. They saw soldiers being impatient, restless, angry, impulsive. They had a problem sleeping. They had poor memory, poor concentration, anxiety, risky behavior. but they changed the name by the time they created the DSM-3 in 1980, because what they started to realize was that children growing up in high poverty situations were also having the same symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they realized was, man, well, if you can go to a local community and over 27% of the young people had the same diagnosis, we can no longer call it shell shock because they'd never been in war. So they changed the name and took war out of it and called it post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And so they took war out of it because a lot of people who've never been in war showing the exact same diagnosis. And so therefore they changed it. So now we talk about PTSD. Now we're seeing the same things once again in schools. And so the framework that we said, well, if the military has been studying PTSD for years before everybody else was, what does the military do for soldiers when they come back home to help set them up for success? And I literally took those principles and said, well, I'm an educator. Let's apply what we can to schools and see what fits. And so here's we rounded it down to. So the Department of Defense says 4 things. They say signs of care is number 1. Number 2, movement as a stress release was a second thing they did for soldiers when they came home to help them deal with stress and trauma. Number 3, create reliable structures for soldiers when they came home. And number 4, create a pleasant and soothing environment when in their homes. And so these are strategies that they help soldiers create. And so I said, okay, I'm an educator. How can I apply this in a school? So for number 1, if they said to help mitigate the effects of trauma and stress on people, create signs of care. So I said throughout our school day, from the time the kids get there at 7:30 to the time they leave at 3, how can we show signs of care to kids throughout the day? And the first thing was, well, when kids walk to the door at 7:30, we have teachers at their different arrival posts. Now, teachers are usually doing arrival duty because they have to. The principal says, be there. Yeah. And usually they're like, so that no fights happen, so that kids do what they're supposed to do. Well, we didn't structure our arrival post for that. We structured it so to make sure that the minute kids walk on our property, they see a caring face that welcomes them into the building and says, we're glad you're here. Mm-hmm. Which means that the teachers that kids love the most, we made them the first ones that kids saw when they got out of the car or when they got off the bus. And so if that teacher that makes every kid smile when they come to the classroom, let's make sure that teacher's post is the first post off the bus. So that no matter what kids went through the night before, the first thing when they get off the bus, they see the teacher that they love the most. Wow. Smiling, and literally we worked with that teacher to show signs of care, to high five, handshake, whatever, just to say, we're glad you're here. We've been waiting for you. And that's how kids come onto our school property now as a sign of care. Also, teachers wise, when kids get in the building, have you seen those viral YouTube videos and TikTok videos where there's a teacher at the door who has like 10 handshakes? Right, and so those kind of things, right? And so here's the thing, we get real excited about like kind of the outward expression, but we stop looking at the research about why teachers are doing it. It was a show an individual connection and relationship of, I know there are 20 kids in this class, but I have something special with you. I acknowledge you for you. So you have to get your own handshake. That's what that was. But when we just get excited about the outward approach and expression of it, we stop studying the research behind it. And so now all these teachers are replicating it, but don't realize what it was really about. And it loses its effect. So that is a sign of care when you have an individual handshake and greeting for every kid that walks in your class. That is a sign of care. And so just literally things like that all throughout the day, as many times as we can do it, is one way in which we let kids feel like you're welcome and this is your home. That is one way to help mitigate the effects of trauma. Does that make sense so far?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would totally fail on the handshake as an educator. I would totally fail. An epic fail.
And honestly, I literally had to redo where teachers were because I did not want the teacher who just feels like everything is a duty. I did not want them to be the first that my kids saw.
Yeah.
I see how intentional it is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And mind you, this is not an extra duty. This is not an extra thing. This is just a repurposing based on research. If you're being intentional about healing trauma and mitigating trauma, then you just move people around. You don't have to change the whole school day. You make small changes. All right. Movement as a stress release. As soon as we got to high stakes testing, we gave more time to ELA and math, the kids to learn more. And we took away PE. We took away recess. We took away all their downtime. in order to even shorten up the time that kids use when they go from class to class, we start having kids stay in one class and having the teacher transition to them to cut down the time, to give more time for learning. All of this, and we're taking away movement. Now, but if we studied and understood that movement is a way to help reduce stress.
I see.
Trauma, they need this movement. They need this movement. And so instead of taking away movement, let's put more movement in the day whenever we can to help them mitigate that trauma.
So other than them changing classes, what other movement did you insert into the day?
So the changing classes. So in the middle of lessons, there are a number of teacher strategies that we use to help jog kids' memory to access prior knowledge. So one activity that I wanted teachers to use was, especially like in something easy as math. In math, so within 5 minutes of your class, after they do their do now for their first activity, have all the students do an activity, have them stand up. And then say, okay, we have to really run through the fluency of these multiplication facts to, because you're going to need multiplication to do the advanced math that we're going to do in the next 15 minutes. So let's right now run down multiplication facts, have all the students stand up and pepper them with questions. And when they get it right, they sit down. When they, if they get it wrong, they stand up, and literally they're moving, sitting up and down. They're moving from this side of the class to that side of the class in order to get it right. And so we're literally using movement in the instructional model. They don't realize that we're using movement for a stress reducer. They're just having fun because they're moving in math class.
Right. We used to call them brain breaks when I worked at a school in Kansas City. But when you were talking about taking away recess, oh my God, I used to cringe when teachers would do that because they'd use it as a consequence, but it has the unintended consequence of this kid now has more energy when you come back.
And when he was talking about them, allowing the teachers to change classes, I mean, I used to think, okay, that's a good idea. It's going to save time. But you're taking away their movement. You're taking away them, that brain break that you're talking, just a minute to get out and see, talk to a peer in the hall, and even that part, like don't talk in the hallways. Don't, mean, the only little 2 minutes that they get to,
Right.
Absolutely. And really, but science shows that our brain needs these breaks to be able to just kind of like once again, wound down so that it can wind up to do heavy academic and intellectual tasks.
We need them. I mean, I can't even sit in class and not get, I get
Absolutely.
it. No. Awesome information. So number 3.
Yes. So number 3 is a reliable structure as a calming tool. And so having a reliable structure is calming for those who have dealt with trauma. Think about it. When you have food insecurity, you're constantly worried about where it's going to come from. Housing security, you worry about. So a calming, reliable structure helps calm down trauma and helps mitigate the effects of trauma. And for our kids who are dealing with trauma, they need a calm environment, which means it needs to be reliable, which means do not change it up every day. Kids need to know exactly what they're getting into when you're bringing them into it. And on a very, very small, so one thing that we do is make sure that everything for that class is written on the board so that they know what to expect. And literally having the teachers go through and say, guys, so the first 10 minutes, we're going to do this, and then we're going to move to this. Just having that structure is calming for those who get anxiety about not knowing what's going to happen next. If the school day is going to change, in the first thing in the morning, roll it out to kids and say, today, we're going to have a change in our schedule later on today. This part is going to be normal, but later in the day at 1 o'clock, we're going to do this. So just kind of letting people know what that schedule is calming so that they can understand what they have to get themselves ready for. Last thing, even with that small thing, is reliable structure is teachers being where we say and promise we're going to be. If we say that I'm your teacher and I'll be here every day, then we can't keep missing work. Because that is not a reliable structure for kids. Think about it. We're telling kids who are traumatized, look, tomorrow there might be another stranger in this room, just roll with it. And then the next day I'll be back. That is unreliable. That is unreliable. And that is anxiety inducing for kids who are already dealing with high anxiety and trauma. And so just being where we say we're going to be, doing what we say we're going to do, when we say we're going to do it, helps calm trauma and mitigate those effects. So teachers, I know you say calling a substitute because I need a mental day, but when we get our mental day, we do disrupt the calm and we disrupt the order of 25 other students who are expecting us to be where we said we're going to be. So just consider that, which is hard.
Yeah, that is amazing.
And last but not least, create the Department of Defense says create a pleasant, soothing environment. So whenever soldiers are getting together, they constantly have soldiers do meetings when they get back from war, and they create calming, soothing environments. There's music in those environments. That environment is clean. It is not cluttered.
Yeah.
It feels calm. So let's talk about the classroom environment. If our classroom environment is not clean, if it's cluttered, if it's too much stuff on the walls and it's not being cleaned up, then that creates that almost creates a frenzy for kids who need a calming environment. And remember, we're using research of how to mitigate trauma. We're not talking about what I prefer as a principal. We're saying that we care and love our kids. Let's create the best learning environment for them to be their best selves. Yeah. So now when I say teachers, let's clean our room, it sounds different than just a principal saying, clean your room because it needs to be clean. This is not a power trip. This is about calming the trauma down of our kids and helping them be their best selves. And so creating a pleasant, soothing environment. Don't raise our voices. You don't need to yell, because that adds a trigger on the kids.
That triggers me. That triggers me. I've literally worked in a school where, you know, administrators walking down the hall yelling the whole time. Classes are changing, and I'm serious about this. And you know, and I mean, just
even taking the bell. Taking the bell so that there's not announcement interruptions. You're not hearing the bell that disrupts things. Flexible seating in the class. Allowing kids to and we got to take kids out of these rows of 5 rows, just everybody facing forward, but allowing flexible seating in classrooms for kids to be able to relax and choose, even having a choice of academic tasks at the moment. There are 3 academic tasks you have to complete in the next 50 minutes. You choose which one you want to start with. Do you want to start with the hardest or the easiest? Whatever it is to help you be your best academic selves. You're all going to complete them, but you choose. All these things are calming and soothing in an environment to where you're trying to help mitigate the effects of trauma for kids. And these are just kind of a few strategies in a framework that I help use for our school.
Yeah, I love that. And I even, while you were talking, I was thinking about, even giving kids the ability to, if there's a child who is a little bit more, needs a little bit more movement. Yes, rambunctious, letting them stand if they need to. Or I remember back in the day, you couldn't have a water bottle at your desk. But that's one of the first things that we need to go to is hydration when we're, dysregulated. And so I love those strategies. That's just really great.
And the last thing that I'll say, usually, and like, even to your point, having a standing desk in the back of the room for the kids who like need to stand up, like having that, in the back, like all these are strategies to use. And all schools are using some forms of these. They are, but just some, but not just doing it, but they're not doing it intentionally. All schools using a form. What I want to push schools to do is this. Don't do this just for the kids whose trauma causes them to act out. Don't do this just for the kids whose trauma response causes them to shut down.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. We give the best of these resources to the kids who struggle the most with it. But here's the thing. Your straight A students, as well as your CDF students, are all dealing with trauma, although it is expressed differently. So therefore, don't just reserve your great trauma, trauma-infused practices for those who are struggling the most. Do it for all. So literally moving it from a tier 3 practice for just the few who are struggling the most to a tier 1 practice, which means every kid in the building deserves the best of these practices. So do it for all, not just for some.
Wow. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, you really just broke it all down for us.
I hope it was helpful.
And you have to promise us that you will come back, Dr. Brown. You have to promise us that you will come back, because I really want to know how difficult it is for schools that aren't trauma informed, to transition into that space of being